Hey folks, Tim Newman with Soft Light Studios coming to you again from Columbus, Ohio. And as you can imagine, we are still in a lockdown state here, as is most of the rest of the world from what I understand. I'm perfectly fine with that. We'll stay inside and let those viruses just fight with one another out in the empty streets. That's perfectly good with me. I did have a request come in today, and that was a request to explore the gradient tool in Photoshop. And on one hand, I'm not entirely sure that the person who requested it understood the breadth of their request, because when you really think about the gradient tool, there is a ton to it. But I think this is going to be a fun series because you're going to see a lot of cool things that the gradient tool does, and you're going to learn a lot of really cool power tricks out of this, which makes Photoshop that much more fun to use. Let's take a look. This is going to be our first video in our series on Photoshop's gradient tool. And I'm not really sure how many videos we'll end up with by the time we're all done. And this is due in part to the fact that while on the surface the gradient tool looks relatively simple, under the covers there's a very complex and powerful set of features that exist within this tool. What at first blush may look like a tool that simply splashes some paint on a layer in an organized fashion really belies the fact that there is a tremendous amount of capability here to create complex masks, including gradient masks that can be applied to layers in composite images. Easiest way to explore the gradient tool is to jump right into Photoshop and start taking a look at the tool. So here we go. So here we have a Photoshop document that's put all together for us. I'm going to jump up here in my little picture-in-picture frame and talk about this for a second, and then I'll go away and get out of your way. In this document, we've just created an 8x10 document here, standard photo size. We are at 300 pixels per inch. We're in the RGB color mode. We're at 8-bit color depth, which really doesn't matter for what we're doing here. And as I disappear off the screen here, you'll notice that we just have one single layer, and that's the background layer here. Now, just to give us something to work with as a separate layer, I'm going to come over here and hit the plus icon, and I now have a blank layer, which is, as you can see here, looking at the icon in the layer strip, a transparent layer, has no content in it yet. Now the gradient tool over here in the toolbar hangs out with the paint bucket tools, and if I hit the G key, you notice the paint bucket tool comes up first, and if I keep going, I get to another paint bucket tool. I keep going one more time. There's the gradient tool ready to go. And you can tell that the gradient tool is active both because this icon is highlighted here, and up here in the tool option bar, you notice that we see a number of features up here for the gradient tool. So we know we've got that tool active and ready to go. Now, one of the things that we want to do here in exploring the gradient tool is really have control over where we're starting and stopping our gradients, because that's the best way to understand how this tool works. And in order to do that, I'm going to come out here and I'm going to set up a new guide layout, and I'm going to go ahead and do 2 columns and 2 rows. That gives me a set of crosshairs exactly at the middle, and I'm going to go ahead and put margins on here. And for my margins, I'm going to zero them all out. So my margins are sitting at the outside edge of my document. In fact, what I'm going to do is just zoom out 1, because that'll give us ability to really see what's going on here. So there's a document that is going to give us some real control over drawing these gradients, because what we'll do is when we draw a gradient, we'll start at an intersection of guides and use those as our snap points to draw our gradients out. Okay, the first gradient we're going to take a look at is just this standard black and white gradient that comes up, and as you notice, it's one of the basic gradients that happens to be loaded up here, and we'll talk about that more in a future video, but we'll stick with that black and white gradient for now. And you can see whichever one I've clicked on, that becomes the active gradient, and if I hit the return or enter key, that will lock that change in there. You'll notice as I look over here that we have some various different ways that we can draw this black and white gradient that we've just picked out. There is a linear gradient, and then there's a radial gradient. There is the angle gradient. There is the reflected or mirrored gradient, and then there is the diamond gradient. One of the other things that all of the gradients support is various blend modes. You can see the ones that can be used here. We're going to leave blend modes out of this conversation for now, and we're just going to go with the standard normal mode, and we're also going to stick with 100% opacity. There are some other options here. There is reverse, and if I click on the reverse button, you'll notice that white and black switch places in this gradient, and they just happen to go in the opposite order color-wise. Just takes your gradient and flips it around the opposite direction. There's also options here for dither and for transparency, and we're going to explore all three of these options in a future video as well. So we're just going to stick with the normal blend mode, opacity at 100%, and then we'll work through some sample gradients here. So with the linear gradient picked and our going from white to black and not reversed, if I click over here at this side of the document, this intersection, and I drag all the way across, I can have this gradient run any direction I want. But if I drag across and I snap to this other edge of the document over here, so I got a perfectly straight line, you'll see that from the left edge of the document, we go from white all the way to black at the right edge of the document. And so the transition that's happening here from the starting point in this gradient, the white, all the way over here to the ending point in this gradient, the black, is happening within the distance that we draw that line. If we want to redraw this gradient, what I'm going to simply do is do a Command Z, so I clear out what I just did. And this time I'm going to start with my linear gradient in the middle at this intersection and work my way to the right. Again, snapping to those intersections at each of those points to keep it nice and straight. You'll notice now that the start of the gradient again starts at the starting point of our line and then finishes up here with black at the ending point of our line. So we actually made that transition from one side of the gradient to the other in the distance of that line. Now the question is, what happened to the left of that line? Well, let's turn off the background so we can be sure. But in fact, it took the starting point of the gradient and it extended it out to the left of the starting point of the line. So it actually fills the entire layer with the gradient, but it makes the starting point of the gradient to the ending point of the gradient happen in the distance where we drew the line. Now I could do this a little bit differently. I could come down here and say, well, let's start down at this corner and let's draw up to this corner. Now in this case, I don't need to erase the gradient because it's going to just overwrite the whole layer. And you'll notice our gradient now goes from the lower left being white to the upper right being black. If I take this and I reverse it and go the other direction, I didn't really have to hit the reverse button at the top. I just draw the opposite way, and it again always uses my starting point to use that color on the left, and that always uses my ending point to end up at that color on the right up there in our tool option bar as our gradient definition. So if I flipped reverse around, you notice that we flip directions here, and if I draw the same direction, what I should now get is a black to white gradient across there. So it's pretty predictable. And I don't necessarily use reverse very often because it's just easier to come in here and draw whatever direction I want to draw in a starting point and ending point that I like. Just working top to bottom, we can do that as well. This should go from the white being top to the bottom being black. There you go, pretty straightforward. If I draw here the opposite direction, I'm going to put the starting point white at the bottom, the ending point black at the top. So pretty straightforward. Now, a couple of different things that we'll do here. I'm just going to take my gradient line and just go this far. And look how quickly I transition. It goes from being a very smooth gradient to a very kind of rugged, quick gradient. Happens very quickly. Now I'll take this and go a little bit further. Let's say that I zoom out on this document and I start drawing my gradient out here and I go all the way up to here. Now I really only put 1/3 of my total gradient line within the document, and there's 1/3 before the document and 1/3 after the document. So if we were going to predict what's happening here, we would expect to kind of be in a grayscale throughout the middle of the document. Most of our white is happening before the document. Most of our black is happening after the document. So that's what we would expect to be in the middle. Let's test that out. Yep, exactly what we expected. In fact, we're not getting much of a gradient out of that at all, and that's because, as we said, most of the white is happening in the lower left before the document, and most of the black is happening in the upper right after the document. If I just shorten that up a little bit, I'm going to have less grayscale and more of the gradient. So you have a tremendous amount of control in where you start and stop the gradient line. And I think you've seen that in all the examples that we've done here. One other thing I want to show you here real quickly, because I think this is very advantageous. We've been using the guides to do it so far. But if I start drawing a gradient line here, you can see I can pretty much go to any angle I want. The minute I hold down that shift key, you'll notice that I'm locked into a situation where my gradient line can only be at 45-degree radiance. And that can be really handy, especially if I'm trying to draw, for example, a horizon mask in a picture, and I want to make sure I'm going straight up and down, and I just start up here and I say, oh, that's right, hold the shift key down, and now I've got a straight up and down gradient there. So I think you could see that pretty quickly. Let's take a look at now this radial gradient here, and we're basically going to start in the middle, and I'm going to draw out here to the edge, and you can see there we have a radial. Basically, you picture the gradient happening in an outward fashion, working its way around in a radial around that center point. And wherever I put the center point at versus the length that I draw this out is where the center of the gradient is going to be, and the length of the line is how big that gradient is going to be. So if I wanted a really small circle here in the middle, no problem, I can do that. Now, I think you can imagine by extrapolation pretty quickly, that could potentially be a nice mask for the sun. So there's a thought for you as we think about applying this to masking tools moving down the road. Let's come up here next and take a look at this angle gradient. And the angle gradient, we can take a look at that the same way. We'll start at the center and we'll draw off to a side. Basically, starts at our starting point, works its way around in a circle, and eventually ends up at the ending point. The interesting thing about the angle gradient is because of the way this thing starts at the starting point and works its way around in a 360-degree circle, where it ends and butts up next to the beginning, it actually looks like a pretty harsh gradient there, but it's really not. We're just seeing the starting point and the ending point butted up against one another here in a way we would not normally see it. Now, there are things we can do to gradients to take care of this hard ending point depending on how we define the gradient, but that's probably about 2 or 3 videos into the series. Let's take a look at the reflected gradient here, and the reflected gradient here is really pretty cool. I'll just start here in the middle and go up part ways. And you can see in the reflected gradient what it does is it takes our starting point and our ending point to draw out a gradient, and then it takes and mirrors that starting point and ending point to the opposite side of what we're working on here. If I went this direction off of my center line up here to the upper corner, we would expect a reflected gradient that goes white in the center to black in the upper left, and then ultimately we would expect the same thing from the center to the lower left, right? And there we have it. So you can see that real quickly. Again, if I reverse this, I could take this reflected gradient and say, okay, we're going to go white to black here. Working our way to the center, and then again from the center working our way downward, we would expect that to go the opposite direction. Now, interesting that it didn't mirror the same way there. I'm a little surprised by that one. So let me see if I can figure out why that is. We certainly had no problem. Oh, duh. That makes all the sense to the world in me now that I think it through. This is one of these things about the gradient tool. You kind of got to think about some of the subtleties to it, right? We started up here as the starting point, and we always said that the reflection happens at our starting point. So the reflected part of this gradient, if I draw it out this way, think about it for a second. Where is the reflected part of this gradient? Oh, it's up and to the right outside the document. So instead of starting there, let's draw it this way. Ah, there's exactly what we were looking for. So now you can see the difference is all about where we put the starting point of that gradient. Caught myself off guard there, but that happens with this tool, and you just got to take a few seconds to think through it. It's usually pretty predictable. Last but not least, we have this diamond gradient that we can apply here. And if I start in the center and work my way out, you'll see that we end up with a diamond shape in the center. Now, this is going to be one of those ones that could catch you off guard like the last one just did me. Look at our diamond shape now. Obviously, our starting point was on the right side of the document. The other half of the diamond shape reflected itself to the outside of the document. So if I wanted to do something like that, again, start to the middle and draw outside that way, and you can see the difference. Or if I really want to do that black to white through the center, this is one of those situations where, in fact, reversing the gradient with the reverse option is what's going to make all the sense in the world. So sometimes you just got to play with it a little bit. A lot of times when I'm working with gradients, I'll give myself a sample layer to take a look at, and I'll just play with that and see what happens. And then ultimately, when I'm comfortable with where the gradients are going to go, I'll go ahead and build my mask layer or build the gradient I want to actually have. And it's pretty straightforward and easy to do that in Photoshop. Hopefully this gave you a pretty good idea of how the gradient works and gave you a good idea on what to expect here. I'm going to pop outside here into full screen and come up with a few comments, and then we'll be out of here. So let's bring me back up on the screen here. Well, maybe. Sooner or later, I'll get this switcher all completely figured out. It's nothing more exciting than switching by yourself and trying to figure out which buttons are working while you're looking at the camera and running Photoshop at the same time. Hopefully that was a good introduction to gradients for you. Pretty quick, pretty high level, but gives you enough to play with, and certainly gives you some ideas on where your starting points and your stopping points should be for drawing out gradients, how the length of the line or the shortness of the line is going to affect the gradient, and all of the different gradient options are up there in terms of whether it's linear or radial or angular or reflected or diamond shaped, right? So all the ones that you can use up there. I would encourage you in some spare time, if you got a laptop and you're sitting here watching TV because you're locked inside the house and can't go anywhere, just play with them. Just get in there and take a look at that. From here, what we're going to do in our next video is we're going to start to explore the notion of putting in custom gradient settings in here and making our own gradients. So we'll start to go down that path and see some of the ones that are built in and some of the ones that we can create, which are pretty cool. And I'm sure that'll take a couple videos. Hopefully this will keep you entertained for the rest of the evening and something to play with. Stay inside, stay safe, stay away from that nasty COVID-19 virus. Do your part to socially distance and isolate, and let's get this thing over with and move on as quickly as we can. Thanks for tuning in. Hope you have a good night. See you tomorrow.